While I was a radio presenter, I used to feel, and I hope none of my previous bosses are watching this. So I produce and host my podcast by myself. So for my bits, the software that I use is Audacity. The last thing I want to talk about is the RSS Feed, which is really simple syndication. Yeah, that's what it stands for. Hi, my name is Adele Onyango. I'm a Kenyan media personality. I've been in traditional radio for 10 years. Then I branched out to get into podcasting, which is where I've been for the last year and a half, and I love it. This is episode 3 of a series of videos I'm doing answering your questions on podcasting. Episode 1 had everything to do with the microphones that I used to record. Episode 2 was on content, and this particular video is going to look at the editing software that I use, the platforms that I put my podcast on, and the distributor that I use. Yeah. So I produce and host my podcast by myself. While I was a radio presenter, I used to feel, and I hope none of my previous bosses are watching this, but I used to feel sometimes, kind of all the time, overworked. I really did, and there were points where I enjoyed it, and there were points where I was just like, Maze, can you just hire somebody else? This work is too much, because I would be behind the desk controlling the technical side of the show. Obviously, if I had a co-host, because there's shows that I did have a co-host, there were shows that I was alone. You know, we've come up with a content direction for the show, which is great. That part I didn't have issues with. So the technical bit, I'm cutting up audio, picking up phone calls, making sure the songs are like coming along together. And so on days that I hadn't slept well, I'd just be like, it's too much. And then I knew that other media houses, some of them had producers for each show, right? And so I was just like, man, what about me? But in hindsight, I'm so thankful that I had to do all of that by myself, because it gave me the skills to be able to produce my podcast alone. So in terms of editing, week-to-week editing of the stories that are on the podcast, which is Legally Clueless, and my bits of the podcast, I do that all by myself. When I have commercial sponsorship, and I need to create imaging around the features, so it's like blah, 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 brought to you by, yeah, I outsource that. Shout out to Jackie, who's just such an amazing producer. My producing skills are not on her level, so when I have commercial sponsorship, I outsource that and pay her for that. Also, shout out to Jackie, because she made the first ever tags for the feature on the podcast. Just as I was, in fact, she made them on my last day on traditional radio. Yeah, and she didn't even know that was my last day. I left like a thief in the night. But yeah, so for the tags, she produced those. Her producing skills are pretty dope. But week to week, I do the production. So for my bits, the software that I use is Audacity. It's a free audio editing software. It's free, but you can make donations, which I've done in the past, because I'm just like, yo, these guys, they've held me down. So it's very easy to use. There's a lot of tools that you can improve your audio with in post. So I have no problems with Audacity. I have it on my HP. I have it on my Mac, just in case. Those of you who listen to the podcast, you know my laptop issues. So it's everywhere. Audacity is on all laptops, just in case. I also like that I can record live onto Audacity, so I don't have to migrate my bits onto it when I'm producing the podcast. So what I will do is I will put a link in the description to the official Audacity page. I will also put a link to an article that lists top 10 free audio editing softwares, so you can check out, and maybe Audacity doesn't do it for you, you can look at all the others. And then I would urge you, if you don't know how to cut audio, just Google tutorial for the software that you've decided to go with. So if you decide to go with Audacity, just Google a tutorial. It's really not that hard. It looks hard at the beginning, but with time, you'll get the hang of it, and you'll only get better the more you use it. So why do I edit myself? One, because I can, and two, because of consistency. So you see, if I had to pay a producer for every episode, and my podcast episodes go up weekly, that means I would have to pay them 4 times in a month, right? And I'd have to pay them even when the podcast isn't bringing in revenue in terms of advertising, etc., etc. So what happens the time when I don't have the money to pay the producer? Does that mean there's not going to be an episode, you know? So I'm grateful that I do have the skills to be able to produce my podcast myself. I also do it because I genuinely enjoy it. Like, for me, it's not even work. So I produce twice a week. On Sundays, I produce the Legally Clueless episodes that go online. And then on Thursdays, because my podcast is syndicated, it plays on Trace Radio, I produce the episodes that play on Trace Radio on Thursdays. Okay, so platforms. Where is my podcast? So Legally Clueless is on SoundCloud, Castbox, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify, it's on iHeartRadio, it's on Ghana, it's also on TuneIn, Deezer, Stitcher, Radio.com. So quite a few platforms actually. And so what I did as I was getting into podcasting is ask a couple of my friends who listen to podcasts, where do you listen to your podcast on? Like what platform? And then I was like, okay, checked out the platforms. Quite a few people said Castbox. Quite a few people say Google Podcasts. That was really big. And then obviously what were iPhone, who actually in my core demographic aren't too many. Say of course that they listen to their podcasts on Apple Podcasts. So initially that's what guided where my podcast got onto first. So I remember I put it first on SoundCloud and then got onto Castbox, Google Podcasts. Like I was just feeling it as we go. Another thing that guides me is market. So I'm very clear that in Kenya, these are the platforms that people listen to podcasts most on. And then if I'm going to look into South Africa, or if I'm going to look at America or India, I'm like, okay, so these are the platforms people use to listen to podcasts. So I want to make sure that my podcast is on there. And then I also choose platforms that give me really good insights for me to better understand my audience, to better understand what's working, what's not. So that's something that I factor in when I think of what platforms is my podcast on. In terms of distributors, I am with Libsyn. Shout out to Dr. Yemisi, who is the founder of the African Women in Media Conference. We were chatting last year. The conference was here in Kenya. And we had dinner one night and I was like, yeah, I've got it into podcasting. Wood. And she's like, do you know Libsyn? Blank. And she was like, sis, you better get it. And so they are a host, so you can host your podcast with them, but they also have distributing services. So what's really dope is they've been in the game since 2004. So they've gained a lot of trust and they have really good partners. So through them, I get into various platforms that I would not be able to access directly. They also have options for you to build an app for your podcast. Like, it's pretty good value for your money. So yes, it's not a free thing. If you go to Libsyn's website, which of course I will link in the description, you can see the various price bundles that they have. There are quite a few different platforms that not only host but also distribute. What I will do is put a link to an article that lists 31 various podcast hosting platforms. And if you read through each of them, some of them actually have distributing aspects as well. So check it out, see which one works for you. The last thing I want to talk about is the RSS feed, which is really simple syndication. Yeah, that's what it stands for. So basically with this RSS feed, if you put your podcast on a platform that generates that feed for you and you click that you want it to be open, then other podcast platforms will pick up your podcast. So for example, my podcast is on SoundCloud and I have my RSS feed open there. And so quite a few platforms that I may not even really know about. Some of them I'm like, hey, my podcast is on that. But because my RSS feed is open, different podcasting platforms have picked it up. I really don't have an issue with that because it's distribution. It means more people can listen to the podcast. And what's also dope is that SoundCloud tracks, right, the insights for me. So either way, I know who's listening and what platforms they're listening from. A good thing to note though is that with SoundCloud, you may need to pay a bit extra. So I'm on SoundCloud Pro so that I can access better insights and better understand what's going on with my podcast. So I know on SoundCloud where I access my RSS feed is I go to settings, then to content, and you will find it there. The reason I'm sharing this is because it took me such a long time to figure out where the heck that RSS feed is. I think I even had to Google it. I was like, what the fuck? Where is it? So yeah, just go to your settings tab, content, and you'll find your RSS feed. I know I've given you a lot of information in this video. Just bite at it. Google some more, do your own research, read the articles that I've listed in the description, and then find the formula that works for your podcast. And speaking of podcasts, check out mine, which is Legally Clueless. New episodes every Monday. And if you are in Kenya, you can find it on Trace Radio every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 a.m. and at 8 p.m. So to access my podcast, hit the link in the description. But also, if you're watching this on IGTV, just go to my profile and click the link in my bio.